Welcome everyone to session 8 of our series on everyday life in the Roman Empire. Today I want to talk about culture and entertainment. When I suggested this last week, I said something vague about culture, but the difference between culture and entertainment is rather blurred, and so I think it's worth discussing both together. The resulting difficulty is that there is so much to say that I sat up last night wondering what I should leave out. And we'll see how far I get with this. This may be one where I'm able to hurry through things, or it may be one where I must be honest and say I'll finish this one next week with further and better particulars of certain things. But let's see how far we get with it. The cover image is by Lawrence Alma Tadema, a favourite poet, and this is a very good way into the subject. Here you have two women, or two young women, and they are reading. She's reading her favourite poet. And notice that she has a papyrus book in her hands. I'll say something about the nature of papyrus books a little later, but for the moment this is a nice representation of what we all like to believe about the ancient world. And let me be a little more specific on that. This is our understanding of ancient culture, or this is part of the mainstream understanding of ancient culture. You have these great poets, and I'm only looking at the Romans at the moment. You have Ovid, you have Horace, you have Cicero, of course you have Virgil. These are some of the great writers of Roman civilization. These are the men through whose eyes we largely see Roman culture, and indeed, if you look at Ovid, it's through Ovid's eyes that we see a great deal of ancient culture in general. Or if you look away from the poets and the prose writers, there is the Discobolos. That's a Roman copy from the 2nd century AD. I took that a few weeks ago in the British Museum. Or, we must be broad-minded in these respects, there is a there is a photograph on the right of the Warren Cup, which I took a few weeks ago in the British Museum. It's a rather strange object. What makes it even stranger is if you ask for whom was it produced and what was done with it. I suspect it was commissioned as a set by someone rather wealthy in the late 1st century AD, and he would hand these round at his drinking parties, and everybody would have an appreciative laugh at them. But whatever you think of the subject matter of the cup, this also is part of ancient culture, and it's a part of ancient culture which has received a great deal of attention during the past 50 years. So we think of ancient culture as great names and impressive, or at least very interesting, artifacts. And I could continue. Here is, on the left, here is a copy of a page from the Virgil Vaticanus. That is a copy of the works of Virgil produced in Rome in the 4th century. You have a nice illustration and you have the text underneath. If you look at the text, I want to say more about that a little later, but do notice that it's all in block capitals. That was how the Romans wrote, and there are no spaces between the words, and there is no punctuation. There are some vague dots at the end of clauses. I wouldn't regard that as particularly effective punctuation. On the right, there's a nice mosaic. That's from North Africa, I believe. It's a representation of Virgil, flanked by two of the muses. This is from a Roman villa somewhere in North Africa. It might be Leptis Magna. I didn't say on the slide where it's from, but there it is. It's Virgil sitting with the rejected opening lines of the Aeneid on his lap. Musa mihi causa memorem, etc. So this is what we think of ancient culture. Oh, before we finish with that, there is the English and American artists, let's say European artists in general, often took a rather strange view of Roman life before 1914. Indeed, we've often had some rather strange views of ancient life, and this is probably the most bizarre late Victorian painting I've ever seen on a Roman theme. It is supposed to represent Catullus and Lesbia. What people thought of this when it was first exhibited, I wouldn't like to think. What people think of it now is rather hard to describe, but obviously this is what somebody thought about ancient culture. It is a strange painting. I could say it's an absurd painting, but it is undoubtedly a very strange painting. And so somebody thinks of this as representative of ancient life. You then have the philosophy. Another reason why we are so interested in the ancient world is not simply the literature as literature. It is not simply pretty or interesting objects. It is also the philosophical tradition of the ancient world. And there is a statue of Socrates. Again, I took that in the British Museum a few weeks ago. This is not a statue made of Socrates during his own lifetime. It is a representation of Socrates made during the Roman period. I think it's about 18 inches tall. Obviously, Socrates is regarded as the grandfather of modern philosophy, or the grandfather of the Western philosophical tradition, Plato being the father of the Western philosophical tradition. And although Socrates never wrote anything himself, or at least nothing by him was ever published, there is no doubt that through Plato he has had a tremendous and a continuing impact on Western philosophy. Some of what he says is rather interesting, but I am going through Book 1 of the Republic at the moment with one of my Greek 5 groups, and speaking for myself, every time Socrates opens his mouth with another question, I lose the will to live. I am deeply impressed by the tolerance of the Athenians that they let this man make it into his 70s before they voted to put him to death. He really was like one of those smelly old men who accost you at a bus stop and plague you with questions, until at last the delayed bus turns up and you skip on saying, well, that was very interesting, we must continue this next time. I don't think as much of Socrates as perhaps I should. Again, he is part of ancient civilization, and he has come to us in some degree through the Romans. The Stoics. This is one of the few philosophical traditions to which the Romans were active contributors. The Romans were not a very philosophical people. They didn't like to ask fundamental questions like, what can I know? Do I know if the external world exists? Do I know if other people exist? Is the will free? The Romans were not enormously interested in those questions, but they were interested in philosophy that told them what they should do, and they were particularly interested in philosophy that told them that they were broadly doing the right thing. What they liked about Stoicism was that it focused on self-restraint and aligning reason with nature, and it was very strong on things like duty and devotion to tradition and acting correctly at all times, and a firm belief in social order and cooperation, and generally in toughening yourself for the knocks of life and not being too upset if things didn't quite work out as you expected. the Romans were drawn to the Stoics, and as I said, it's one of the few philosophical traditions to which the Romans made notable contributions. Cicero was drawn to Stoicism, and so was Seneca the Younger. Until fairly recently, most of what we knew about the Stoics came through the Roman philosophers. This is part of ancient culture, and so is this, Epicureanism. Until the 17th century, Epicurus was largely unknown. Not surprising, because although during his lifetime he wrote 300 books, books were rather shorter than ours, but during his lifetime he wrote 300 books. None of these has survived, though we're rather hoping that when the archaeologists eventually break into those vast libraries which are surely lying hidden in the volcanic rock of Herculaneum, we may find a complete copy of his work on nature. Until the 17th century, though, Epicurus was not very well known, and very little attention was paid to him. Then a man called Pierre Gassendi gathered together everything that had been said by or about Epicurus, put it into a big book attended by a vast commentary, and you can date the scientific revolution to the publication of Gassendi's book. It seems that this had an enormous influence on Newton and on many of the other late 17th century philosophers and scientists. Until the middle of the 17th century, Lucretius was occasionally read, but people were not interested in what he was saying. It is only in the 17th century that Lucretius became enormously popular. Book 2 of Lucretius is the key one. It is the one where he explains the atomic theory of Epicurus, that nothing exists except atoms which are eternal and which are eternally in motion, and which come together in semi-accidental clusters, and the entire physical world can be explained in terms of the movements of these very small particles so small that we can't see them, though we can make ourselves aware of them by looking at the evidence of their existence, the fact that as a coin is passed from hand to hand, atoms of the gold or silver are rubbed away. You can't see these films of atoms coming off, but when the coin has passed sufficiently from hand to hand, you can see that the images and words on the coin become rather blurred. It is a deeply impressive theory. Epicurus was not completely original in this. He was following from people like Democritus, but what is so impressive about Epicurus is that he and the atomists turned out to be right. The world is made of atoms. They don't look quite as Epicurus imagined them, things with hooks on of different sizes, but broadly speaking, if you look at ancient science, or if you look at ancient scientific explanations, the one which most aligns with our present knowledge is Epicurus and Democritus and the atomists in general. But Epicurus was also famous for his ethics, saying that the reason we act is to improve our happiness, and perhaps the only reason that we should act should be to improve our happiness, though what Epicurus meant by happiness is not necessarily eating a lot and drinking a lot and having a lot of sex. It is understanding your place in the universe and being kind to your friends. Epicurus was very popular in Italy in the first centuries BC and AD. Indeed, it seems that Epicureanism was the mainstream philosophy of the Greek and Roman world until about 200 AD. There's a great deal of evidence for that. You have the existence of Lucretius's poem. It's one of the greatest of all Roman poems, and it's also the strangest epic ever written. You have statements by Cicero that Epicurus was wildly popular in Italy. You have the disparaging remarks, indeed the full-scale attacks of non-Epicurean writers like Plutarch. There's also the testimony of the Jews. The Jews have a particular name for somebody who abandons Judaism. They call him, I think, an Epicureanism. The belief is that this derives from Epicurean. It seems that those Jews in the early imperial period who left the Jewish faith and assimilated to the mainstream tended to become Epicureans. From the 2nd and 3rd centuries onwards, they obviously became Christians because that was the mainstream. But it seems that in the earlier period, Jews who abandoned their ancestral faith tended to become Epicureans because that was the philosophical mainstream. From the word apikoursim in Hebrew, we have the idea that at some time, probably the 2 centuries around the birth of Christ, Epicureanism was the philosophical mainstream in the Mediterranean world. We then have all the pretty things of the good life. Here are some more photographs I took in the British Museum a few weeks ago. It's all from Britain, and Britain, it seems, in the later imperial period, was one of the wealthier of the western provinces. London may have had a population of 250,000. It seems to have been well over 100,000 at times. We have, for the past few centuries, been digging up some very luxurious Roman villas all over the south of England and the Midlands. And this, I think, is the Mildenhall treasure from the middle of the 4th century, when Britain was going through its golden age of the Roman occupation. It is very beautiful and very impressive silverwork. Again, a product of ancient culture. This is part of ancient civilization. Obviously, not everybody in the Roman world was able to enjoy the good things of life. Not everybody could have solid silver tableware. I don't think I need to explain what I mean by that. This is a society where most people are decidedly poor by modern standards, and where the people able to afford such beautiful objects would have been an almost insignificantly small percentage of the population, maybe 1%, maybe half of 1%. You can focus on the beautiful objects which have survived from antiquity and say, this is ancient culture, this is ancient civilization. But we must accept at the same time that the overwhelming majority of people would have been in no position to possess such objects and may not really have seen them very often. But there is the intellectual culture of the ancient world that was surely very widely spread through the Mediterranean. Surely, and perhaps not everybody had read Epicurus, not everybody who spoke Latin would have read Cicero and Virgil, but these were as much the great names of the ancient world as Shakespeare and Dickens and all the other great names are for us. Ancient culture was very broadly based. A very large number of people, perhaps not quite the majority, but a very large number of people would in some degree have participated in the more intellectual side of ancient culture. And if you look at the evidence, it does seem that reading and writing were very broadly based skills. Let's have a look at some of these pictures. I took these in Aphrodisias in Turkey. I took these on a family holiday in 2010. On the left, you have an inscription on a pillar, probably from about 450 AD. What does it say? Eis ton kosmon, something missing, holones hotheos. To the world. God gave something to the world. And on the right, you have a series of inscriptions, again from Aphrodisias. These are all dedicatory inscriptions to various emperors. Probably they are statue bases, and bronze statues of the emperors would have been on top of those bases. Let's have a look. One of them is for Marcus Aurelius, I think. The other one is for the Emperor Nerva. The one on the far right, if I blew it up, I could probably read it, but reading Greek inscriptions is not my speciality. And there we have another almost random selection of inscriptions. They're pretty random because I chose inscriptions that would fit onto one slide. On the left, you have the financial accounts published in Athens around 400 BC for the building of the Erechtheum on the Acropolis. On the right, you have a dedicatory plaque put up around 100 AD in Mycenae in the southern Peloponnese. I was there last October, and that's when I took this photograph. This is recognition by Mycenae of one of its most famous local men, a man called Titus Flavius Socrates, who was another Plato in his philosophical abilities. Never heard of him otherwise, but he was famous in Mycenae. In the middle, you have a plaque that I saw put up in the Colosseum. It was put up around 500 AD, we can tell by the lettering. It's put up by a consul. He has paid from his own funds for the restoration of the Colosseum after it was damaged in an earthquake. I'll carry on showing you these inscriptions before I make the obvious point that comes out of them. On the left, you have the famous Dassumius gravestone from the British Museum. Again, I was there a few weeks ago and I took this then. It is a gravestone put up by a man called Dassumius to his wife. She was a slave whom he freed and married. I think I told you about this a few weeks ago, so I'll say no more about it. It is, from the point of view of social history, a very important document. On the right, you have the Draco gravestone, again in the British Museum, about 200 AD. It is a gravestone put up to an Egyptian sailor. In the middle, I found this in my files last night. I took this in Rome a very long time ago. It is a gravestone put up to Attida, the dearest wife of a man called Marcus Flavius Antoninus, probably around 200 AD, though looking at the lettering it may be a bit later. There on the left you have one of the Vindolanda tablets, writings on very thin plywood. In itself not immediately interesting, but of enormous interest if you want to know about the military organisation of Britain and the social life of the empire. So I suppose in itself it is very interesting. Top left of the slide, you have a bronze juryman's ticket. This is not from the imperial period. This is from Athens around the 4th century BC. What it does is it gives the name of somebody who is eligible for jury service. These bronze tickets were put into some kind of machine, spun about, and names were pulled out at random. The right-hand side of the slide, you have a representation of the crucifixion. There on the left is Judas hanging himself, but notice the writing on it. Rex Judiorum. When Pilate had Christ crucified, he had a board put up above the cross with, in 3 languages, Jesus Christ, the King of the Jews, in Greek, in Latin, and I think in Aramaic. And here is some reference to it in this ivory carving. Oh, and here, I probably have no valid reason for showing this, but it's something that I couldn't resist putting into the slides. This is the gravestone of a most unfortunate young man. Passer-by, Aphrodisios is my name. I'm a citizen of Alexandria, Troas, and a leader of the chorus. I die a most pathetic death because of my wife, the dirty adulteress, whom Zeus will destroy. Her secret lover, Lycon, a member of my own family, slaughtered me still in my youth. He threw me from the heights like a discus. I was 20 years old, so full of beauty, when the Moirai spun their fate and sent me as a delight to Hades. That's a tombstone in the Louvre. To wrap this up, you go to a museum filled with ancient artifacts. You go to an archaeological site, a ruined city like Ephesus or Aphrodisias, or you take yourself around Rome, and wherever you look, there is the written word. It's very easy to imagine that this was as literate a civilization as, shall we say, England in the 18th century. Nobody would say that everybody was literate, that the people slaving away in the fields to die in the late 20s were literate, but it is easy to believe that perhaps a majority of city dwellers, perhaps a majority of city-dwelling men, were literate. Why otherwise would there be so much use of the written word? Why would poor Aphrodisias, or why would the relative of poor Aphrodisias have this gravestone set up unless he believed that a very large number of people would read what it said? Why all of those gravestones? Why all of those inscriptions showing the financial accounts of the building of one of the Acropolis temples? Why commit so much to writing and then put it up in public if only a very small minority of people around would have been able to read it? It seems perfectly reasonable that very large numbers of people in the ancient world were literate, and that the ancient world, in some periods of its history, was about as literate as Europe in the 18th century. That being so, you can imagine that very large numbers of people would, or at least could, have participated in the intellectual and literary culture of the ancient world, maybe not as creators, but certainly as consumers. The difficulty with this belief that it's very easy to acquire and very easy to hold, is that there is very little reason to suppose that large numbers of people were literate. Here is a book that I strongly recommend, an enormously interesting book. William V. Harris, Ancient Literacy. He goes carefully through all of the evidence and all of the claims about the evidence, and he says that at any one time in antiquity, any one time between about 600 BC and 600 AD, not more than 5% of people in any one generation were able to read and write. He spends a lot of time defining what we mean by reading and writing, and he does point out that the ability to read does not necessarily imply the ability to write, and even that the ability to read doesn't mean that you can curl up in bed with Book 6 of the Aeneid. He goes through a great deal of the surviving evidence. He also makes a number of probabilistic arguments. One of the most compelling arguments he makes is about people's eyes. Here is a table in the top of the slide showing the percentage of people in the United Kingdom who need glasses for reading. Between 18 and 34, between 20 and 30% of the population needs corrective spectacles. As you get to the 35 to 54 age group, this rises above 50%. Once you go beyond 55, it rises beyond 70% until once you get beyond 65, the number goes past 90%. You can take issue with this. I have rather bad eyes. I have astigmatism, and I'm either short or long-sighted. I'm not quite sure because I started as short-sighted and may have become long-sighted since then. But although when I take my glasses off, I have trouble seeing much at all, I have no reasonable doubt that if I were to take these glasses off and leave them off for a few days, my vision would recover considerably. I don't know how much I could read, but I would be able to read something. So these are rather liberal figures of people who need glasses for reading. But you can see that very large numbers of people do need corrective glasses in order to read. And as we get older, the number of us who need corrective glasses rises. They didn't have glasses in the ancient world. Here's a bit from Seneca the Elder. Letters, however small and dim, are comparatively large and distinct when seen through a glass globe filled with water. They did have some means of optically enlarging letters. It was possible to read very slowly, but reading a book through a fishbowl of water is not the most convenient way to go about it, is it? There are some pictures on the slide of people in the Middle Ages wearing glasses. There's Conrad von Soest, the glasses apostle, 1403, and there's a Persian artist called Reza Abbasi wearing glasses in the 17th century. You can see that intellectual creation, intellectual activity of all kinds is greatly assisted by glasses, and the ancients didn't have glasses. That meant that the number of people able to read books, whether or not they could read and write, but the number of people physically able to read books was always a great deal less than 100%, and may have been very much less than 100%. Then we have the comparative evidence. Here on the top right of the slide is a table I've put together to show the estimated and later on the measured literacy rate in England. England is a useful country to take for this because we have a great deal of actual evidence about the English past, more so than most other countries have. And England has always been a fairly wealthy country, but it seems that around 1350 only about 5% of the population was literate, and bear with me in not asking too much about what literacy actually means, but in 1350 maybe 5% of the population was literate. This rises to 10% in 1500, 20% in 1600, and then you can see that by the 18th century it's heading towards and probably goes past 50% until by the late 19th century you have mass adult literacy. And since the 20th century you can say that we've had universal adult literacy. I don't necessarily believe that 2023 figure of 99%, because although I've asked you not to ask me about it, I will say that literacy does not necessarily mean literacy as we would define it. I don't think 99% of the population in this country is able to pick up, shall we say, a novel by Virginia Woolf, or Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, or even Macbeth, and be able to read it straight off. There are many people who are able to read road signs and who are able to read some of the trashier newspapers and are able to read the television schedules, but who do not and cannot read anything more elaborate, shall we say. But you can say that for the past few hundred years, England has enjoyed at least mass adult literacy. Harris asks in his book, what reason have we to suppose that at any time in antiquity did you have something like the kind of literacy that England has possessed since, shall we say, 1600? And his answer is, we have no reason to believe it. We have no reason to believe it because they didn't have glasses. That's one reason. Another reason, because education was monstrously expensive. There is a relief showing a Roman school. Education of all kinds was expensive. Education of all kinds has always been expensive. Of course, there is plenty of evidence from the ancient world for education because they were educated people. There on the right is a photograph of the famous Hawara papyrus, which is evidence from about 150 AD that schoolboys in Egypt, some schoolboys in Egypt, were learning Latin. There is a page of papyrus where somebody has copied out again and again and again a verse from Book 2 of the Aeneid. He's done so in rather strange Latin characters. He's obviously much more at home in Greek than in Latin, but he is learning Latin. So there is evidence that Latin was actively studied by some people in Egypt during the 2nd century. And Suetonius, his work, it's fragmentary and mostly summarised, but his biography of Virgil. Virgil spent his youth in liberal studies, among others supported and educated by Asinius Pollio, who fostered and instructed him with the utmost generosity. What can we say about this? What we can say is that Virgil came from a fairly well-to-do family, not rich, but gentlemen farmers. It was still necessary for somebody of great wealth to finance his education beyond the most basic, which suggests that an advanced education was expensive and therefore not common. There you have from one of the letters of Pliny the Younger, writing around 100 AD, I have arranged that from the revenues food and education be provided for freeborn boys and girls. There is evidence against what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that education was expensive and it was relatively uncommon for other people to pay for education as an act of charity. You can contrast this statement with the bottom right table on this slide, which shows the number of free schools established in England since about 1500. You can see that throughout the entirety of the early modern period, wealthy people or religious organisations were very keen to establish schools to give a free education to the poor. They did this largely because England was a Protestant country in which people are encouraged and even expected to read the Bible. You can't read the Bible if you're illiterate, and so if you want to spread the good word, you'd better cough up a contribution towards the free school that we're building to educate 50 poor girls in Rotherham. There's no evidence for this kind of charitable educational activity at any time in the ancient world. Education was an entirely private matter, and it was the province of the higher classes, who, as I keep on saying, were an insignificantly small fraction of the overall population of the Roman world. If you look at the middle table on this slide, I've put together some figures. I don't vouch for their absolute accuracy, but they're indicative. I've given prices in 1914 pounds because, as I said last week, the pound of our own day is dropping like a stone, and if I reuse these slides in 5 years' time, I shall need to adjust the prices on the right, whereas the prices on the left are given in gold, and so they don't change. But turn your attention to the price in 2020 terms. I've tried to give a table showing the price of a Bible. I've chosen the Bible for obvious reasons. It is the book. For many centuries, it was the only book that people wanted to read or able to read. The only book they thought it worth reading. If you'd wanted to buy a Bible in 1400, it would have cost you, in modern terms, £5,000. That's the price of a used car, isn't it? Quite a good used car. That's significant. It is unlikely that the price of hand-copied manuscripts had significantly changed in real terms since the ancient world, and so if in the Roman world you had wanted to possess a book, you would have had to cough up something like £5,000 in modern money for it. That does not allow any kind of mass market in books to emerge, does it? You'll see that since 1400 the price of Bibles has been steadily dropping. The biggest single drop was between 1400 and 1500 because of the introduction of printing. You can see the approximate price of buying a new Bible at any time between 1400 and 2023. You can buy a Bible now for £4.75 if you look around, though you can probably get them for even less. Indeed, if you look on the internet, you can get them for free. That's where I mostly do my biblical reading nowadays. But coming back to that £5,000 figure, books were expensive because it was necessary to copy them out by hand. It could take 3 months, it could take 6 months for a skilled copyist to produce a single manuscript of the collected works of Virgil. This means that book ownership must have been very restricted, much more restricted than at any time since about 1500 in England. We then have the economic imperatives. This is not a completely fair comparison, but if you look at this painting on the right, William Bell Scott, Iron and Coal, that's from the 1850s. Here you have a society which requires mass adult literacy. Those men bashing iron are probably literate. Indeed, they probably must be literate in order to follow instructions. Literacy is associated with all manner of necessary industrial skills. It is very difficult to imagine any kind of industrial revolution, any kind of extended commerce, without very large-scale adult literacy. Indeed, you'll see the newspaper in the bottom right of the picture. This may be a newspaper that's been laid aside by one of those men bashing the iron. On the left, those men treading grapes. Was it necessary for them to know how to read and write? Not really, no. No benefit for them in learning to read. It is of no instrumental value. Those men on the right, they need to be literate. Those men on the left, they don't need to be literate. And so the men on the right probably are literate, and the men on the left are not. So you have the development of spectacles. You have the growth of a belief in the value of reading the Bible. You have the introduction of printing and a collapse over the past 6 centuries of the price of books, and you have the growth of a new kind of economy which only functions where at least the majority of people are literate. And none of these factors existed in the ancient world. We then come to the nature of writing materials. A single sheet of papyrus in the ancient world, I believe, cost the modern equivalent of £200 or £300. It cost more than a day's wage for an unskilled worker. When I go to the pound shop, I can buy a ream of paper for £3.50. That's 500 sheets of paper, and I can burn through that as quickly or as slowly as takes my fancy. It's only because I'm mean that I save the paper and reuse the other side. I don't need to. If I were to throw it away, it would have no measurable impact on my standard of living. But if a single sheet of writing paper cost £200 or £300, you can be sure that I would write in very small letters, and I'd think very carefully before I put pen to paper so that I didn't need to waste any of it. So papyrus, the main writing medium of the ancient world for the production of literary texts, was itself enormously expensive, and you can add to that the cost of the labour of a scribe to put anything onto it. And so for that reason, everyday writing materials were not papyrus. It was nothing particularly convenient. The most convenient writing medium for everyday purposes was that thing in the bottom right of the slide, a wooden writing tablet. This would have been filled, when it was new, with beeswax. You'd have had a layer of beeswax about 1/8 of an inch thick. You would use one of those bronze styluses, and its use, I think, is self-explanatory. The pointy end you use for writing on the tablet. When you've finished with the tablet and you don't want to keep it, you turn your bronze stylus round and you use the blunted end to wipe over the wax so that you can start again. It's a very convenient writing medium. I believe it was last used in Vienna in the 1860s in one of the government ministries there. So it's a very long-lasting technology. It seems to have emerged around 1400 BC, and it carried on in active use into the 1860s. This was the main writing medium in the ancient world for ephemeral purposes. What you would do is you would write your draft on a wax tablet, and then if you're happy with it, you would copy it or have it copied onto papyrus if you were rich enough, or you would have a large number of these boards. And notice this one from the British Museum has holes drilled in it so that you can tie a number of these together. It is actually a very convenient writing medium. It's reusable. It's very flexible. You can use one board or you can tie 8 or 9 of them together. But that was the main writing medium for ephemeral purposes. If you wanted to record something for the long term, you've got those things on the left, pottery shards, bits of broken pottery. It's not something I would use. Writing on a piece of broken pot strikes me as deeply inconvenient. But you see, because everything was so horribly expensive by comparison with what we pay, because everything was so horribly expensive in what the economists would call real terms, for writing, it seems that most people needed to use pieces of broken pot. And none of this is conducive to mass adult literacy, is it? And so the clear implication of the evidence is that not many people could read or write. And just to reinforce my point, if you move away from writing, if you look at reading, here is an ancient book. This is a page from the Codex Sinaiticus. When Constantine converted to Christianity, or rather when Constantine came out as a Christian in the first decade of the 4th century, when he established Christianity as the preferred faith of the empire, he commissioned 300 churches for the main cities of the empire, and for each of those churches he commissioned a complete Bible. And here is one of the surviving copies of those 300 Bibles. This is Matthew chapter 6. It is, I think, the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Have a look at it. As I pointed out earlier when I was looking at the page from the Virgil Vaticanus, there are no spaces between the words and there is no punctuation. The entire text is written as a continuous stream of letters. If you were to push me, I could read it very slowly. I would read forward a letter at a time until I had a complete word. I would then start again and continue. It would take me a very long time to go through the whole of that page, of course. If this were reading, if this is what I'd been brought up to do when reading, I could go rather faster than I would now, but reading was at no time in the ancient world as easy as it is for us. People didn't have glasses, and the texts themselves were not very user-friendly. If you find a verse in the Gospel according to St. John and you think, that's what I want to think about, or just, that's very well said, I'll make a note of that and I may quote it when I'm writing something of my own. It's quite easy. You make a note, John 15:12. Whereas if you're going through one of these, there's no verse numbering, there's no chapter numbering, there's no page numbering, and finding something in this is not easy. So reading itself is not easy. The books, even if you could afford one, and even if your eyes were up to reading them, books were not very user-friendly objects. Again, suggesting that literary culture was confined to a very small minority of the population. Indeed, it seems to be the case that even very famous classical texts like the Aeneid may not have existed at any one time in more than about 1,000 copies through the entire Mediterranean world. We can lament that we appear to have lost something like 97% of the literature that would have been available in a good library around 200 AD. But when you bear in mind the difficulties of writing, and when you bear in mind the very small number of books that circulated at any one time, we should rather be surprised that so much has survived. So I come back and repeat my point that the literary culture, which for us is the high point of ancient civilization, was not something in which more than a very tiny percentage of any ancient population could share. That's it. It's in Plutarch's biography of Nicias, I think. Yes, you're right. When the Athenians messed up in their invasion of Sicily and the survivors were gathered up by the people of Syracuse and thrown into a stone quarry, those who could recite large chunks of, I think, Sophocles, or it may have been Euripides, were freed, which is good evidence for the ancient memory. Our memories are terrible. You look at something and say, that's interesting, I must remember that, and you don't remember it. But you don't need to. You just need to remember that you've seen something interesting and where you saw it, because you can look it up. Indeed, the internet has made our memories even worse, because all you now need to do is do a general search and you'll get to it. Whereas in ancient times, if you found yourself in a library, you might have a book in your hands that you would never see again. You would read it and you'd memorize it. You'd memorize it as you read. And quite often, if something was read to you, you'd remember it. In an age where you don't have the convenience of modern technology, memory is much more important, and so memories will be much more powerful. We also know that many ancient writers, when they quoted from somebody else, would often do so from memory, because there are all manner of slips in the quotations. You can be quite sure that the writer didn't have the original text in front of him and he was transcribing bits. He was copying it out from memory. Yes, memory does go some way to supplying the lack of abundant copies of cheap books. It only goes so far, though, because you need to be able to understand those books. Following on from Daphne's point, you do have the possibility of oral learning. Most ancient books were written for performance. They were performance pieces. I'm pretty sure that the history of Herodotus was written as a set of performance pieces. Herodotus would go around all the festivals in the Greek world, and he would announce that on a certain day at a certain time he would read about the last stand of the Spartans at Thermopylae, and he would gather a large audience, perhaps many thousands of people. Rather like Dickens used to go around in the 1860s. He would travel through England and America reading from his works. He made a lot of money from that and became very famous for it. There's a painting by Ingres showing Virgil reading book 6 of the Aeneid at a dinner party hosted by Augustus. Yes, there's a quote from one of the letters of Pliny the Younger. Claudius often went to the forum and listened to poets reciting their works. He enjoyed the public readings and was known to be an enthusiastic supporter of the arts, which endeared him to the literary community of his time. That tells you a lot about publication. New books were often published by a public reading. You didn't stick it on Amazon and wait for people to download it and read it and review it. You would stand up in the forum, you'd stand up on the ancient equivalent of a soapbox, and you would read book 1 of your epic poem. If people didn't like it, they would walk past you, or they would call bad names at you and tell you to shut up. If they liked it, there might be a collection afterwards, or if you hit the jackpot, some rich man might give you an invitation to dinner and you'd become his client. If you were taken up by a rich man, you wouldn't just be invited to dinner, you'd be expected to join in the proceedings. And Roman dinners, formal dinners, Roman banquets, weren't just a matter of eating and drinking and a bit of polite chit-chat. You would have readings of poetry, you'd have readings of history, you'd have readings of speeches, you would have music and dancing, you'd have acrobatics, you had an entire experience, an entire entertainment at a dinner party. And so if you were the poet laureate of some rich Roman, you would have an audience for your works that didn't require you to sell copies of your books. You would stand up and recite them as often as you were able, and your reputation would grow from that. If your works were then published and circulated, which gave them some chance of survival down to our own times, that was a little extra. But the main benefit was from the oral recitations. So we shouldn't take too much from the general illiteracy of people, because there was the opportunity to listen to other people reading. And it does seem that those mountains of inscribed stonework from the ancient world that we see all around us in museums and ancient sites could not be read by the majority of people passing by, but there was always somebody who could read, and you could go to someone and say, "Excuse me, can you tell me what that thing up there says?" And he'd read it to you. Anyone caught having lunch on the grass will be flogged and moved on. Oh, thank you for that. I'll bear it in mind. Most people were illiterate. It wasn't as exclusionary as it would be nowadays. But most people were illiterate, and most people did not participate in the literary culture of the ancient world. You then have another fact which limits the possibility of literacy, which is this. If you take up the text of a play by Euripides or Sophocles or Aeschylus or Aristophanes, you're reading something that was written in the spoken language of Athens. These plays were performed in front of many thousands of people, and I may come to theatres soon, but I probably shan't. These works were performed in front of very large audiences who understood them. The works are written in a rather elevated form of the spoken language, but they were still written in the spoken language. That, however, was in the 5th century BC. Equally, when Cicero stood up and made one of his grand speeches, it was in a very tarted up, a very highfalutin kind of the language spoken by ordinary people in Rome, and it is probably the case that most people could turn up to the law courts and listen to Cicero and at least get the generality of what he was saying. But we're talking about the 5th century BC or the 1st century BC. Languages change over time, or rather the spoken language changes over time, whereas in both the Greek and the Latin areas of the Roman Empire, the written language didn't change, or it didn't change significantly. The language in which the New Testament is written is different in many respects from the language of the pagan classics of the 5th and 4th centuries, but most Greek, most educated Greek, paid no attention to changes in the spoken language. You can see changes in the spoken language in the Synoptic Gospels and in Acts of the Apostles, even though Luke was himself an educated man and was writing in what most people would have regarded as pretty educated Greek. You can still see some evidence of linguistic change. Some account is taken of it, whereas in the more literary texts produced in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, no account is taken of changes in the spoken language. And by about 300 AD, it is likely that the great majority of uneducated people could not understand the classical literature of the higher classes. Indeed, the higher classes themselves had trouble with the written word, shall we say. Imagine that it came into fashion in the English-speaking world that the only truly valid kind of written English was Shakespeare, Milton, Bacon, and the authorized version of the Bible. Anything else was barbarous. Now, we have no trouble understanding the authorized version of the Bible and very little trouble understanding Shakespeare and the Book of Common Prayer. Milton can be a bit of a grind at times, but we have no real trouble with a passive understanding of these texts. But you try writing in that language without using modern grammatical constructions and especially modern vocabulary. It would be difficult, and it would prevent any kind of, it would not prevent, it would deter any kind of original literary creation. You would look at the page and you'd write a sentence and you'd say, did that word exist in the 16th century? I don't think it did. Cross it out and start again. It does rather cramp one's originality, doesn't it? But this is something that happened in the Mediterranean world during the 2nd century AD. First in the Greek half and then in the Latin half, there was a reaction against the spoken language, and the only valid literature was considered to be that which was a perfect reproduction in its grammar and vocabulary of the classics in Greek or in Latin. Again, imagine that you wanted to write about penicillin. Penicillin is not a word that Milton knew. It's not a word that Shakespeare knew. So you would have to refer to it as a sovereign remedy against the contagion. You would need to be very inventive in describing modern things without producing new words for it. And this is the kind of straitjacket in which the intellectual classes of the empire placed themselves from about 120 AD onwards. It's not as bad as it would be nowadays because we live surrounded by things which didn't exist 300 and 400 years ago, quite often things which didn't exist 50 years ago. Memory sticks, mobile telephones, SIM cards, inkjet printers, all sorts of things. They're new things, and so they need new words to describe them. You didn't have this continual flood of novelty in the ancient world, so the problem was not quite as great, but it was still a considerable problem. And what this tended to do was to reduce the number of new works that were actually worth reading. And here I come to a quotation from Gibbon, always an enjoyable historian. The love of letters, almost inseparable from peace and refinement, was fashionable among the subjects of Hadrian and the Antonines, who were themselves men of learning and curiosity. It was diffused over the whole extent of the empire. The most northern tribes of Britons had acquired a taste for rhetoric. Homer, as well as Virgil, were transcribed and studied on the banks of the Rhine and Danube, and the most liberal rewards sought out the faintest glimmerings of literary merit. But if we accept the inimitable Lucian, this age of indolence passed away without having produced a single writer of original genius, or who excelled in the arts of elegant composition. The authority of Plato and Aristotle, of Zeno and Epicurus, still reigned in the schools, and their systems, transmitted with blind deference from one generation of disciples to another, precluded every generous attempt to exercise the powers or enlarge the limits of the human mind. A crowd of critics, of compilers, of commentators darkened the face of learning, and the decline of genius was soon followed by the corruption of taste. Gibbon is always worth reading. He has a way with words. And that is an entirely fair comment on the literary culture of the Roman Empire from about 100 AD onwards. And so the literary culture that we regard as the supreme high point of ancient civilization is something which was necessarily confined to an insignificantly small number of people in any one generation. Very few people could read and write, probably never more than 5%, and we need to think very carefully about what we mean by literacy. If somebody was able to read an inscription saying that Hadrian had repaired this bridge, does that mean that he could read the Aeneid or the Iliad or the speeches of Cicero? Maybe, and probably not. So the number of people in any one generation who were literate was insignificantly small. Books were expensive, they were difficult to produce, they were difficult to read, people did not have spectacles, and people did not have the same incentives or imperatives to learn to read and write that had become increasingly common in our own civilization since about 1500. So when we look at the high culture of the ancient world, we're not looking at ancient culture. That is something entirely separate. We're looking at the preferences of the rich, indeed the preferences of the super rich. What I want to talk about next week is the entertainment of the masses. And when I talk about the entertainment of the masses, I mean the entertainment that was enthusiastically shared also by the higher classes. I want to talk briefly about theatre in the Roman world. I also want to talk about the gladiatorial combats, and I want to talk about the chariot races. I will talk about the popular entertainments. That is something in the slides that I produced, but it does seem that I was far too enthusiastic last night, and so rather than try hurrying through all of these slides, I think it's better if I stop here with the repeated claim that what we regard as the culture of the ancient world was not the culture of the ancient world. It was a minority culture of that world. Again, any questions or comments?